My name is Renee Ashford. I'm 35 years old and I've spent 12 years working as a claims adjuster, which means I've spent 12 years being the person who reads the fine print nobody else bothers to read. Last Thursday evening, just as I was locking up my laptop for the night, my phone lit up with a text from my mother that went to the entire family group chat. Wire $7,200 by Monday for Tyler's graduation party. Under it came the photos. A lake house rental with a wraparound dock, custom jerseys with my nephew's number and last name stitched across the back, and a screenshot of a car dealership listing with the caption, "And a little something toward his first car, because he's earned it." I sat there in my kitchen with my coat still on, staring at my phone as it had personally insulted me. But the text wasn't the part that broke me open. What my mother said 11 minutes later, in a voicemail I almost didn't listen to, is the reason I made one phone call that same night, quietly, calmly, at almost midnight. And by the time my family sat down for breakfast the next morning, none of them saw it coming. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the person holding the family together is usually the same one nobody bothers to check on. If a family that only remembers your name when they need your card number sounds a little too familiar, do me a favor, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because this story starts with a graduation party and ends with a ledger nobody in my family knew existed until I set it on the table myself. I read that text 3 times, and I read it the same way I read every claim that crosses my desk, from the bottom up, looking for the number that actually matters underneath all the language wrapped around it. That's the strange gift of my job. Other people see a celebration. I see a total that has to be paid by somebody, and I always seem to know exactly whose account it's going to come out of. My mother hadn't sent the message to me privately. She'd sent it to the whole chat. My father, my brother Kyle, my Aunt Rosalind, even my cousin Marcus, who hasn't spoken a full sentence to me since Christmas of 2019. That wasn't an accident. That was a stage. The lake house photo had a caption underneath it in my mother's handwriting style, all caps and too many exclamation points. Tyler deserves the best send-off. Then the jerseys. Then the car listing, with 3 heart emojis stacked on top of each other like the emojis could soften a number that size. My aunt replied within 90 seconds. So proud of that boy. My father sent a thumbs up, which from him is basically a standing ovation. Nobody in that chat asked how any of it would be paid for, because in my family, that question has only ever had one answer, and the answer has always had my name attached to it. I set the phone face down on the counter and made myself stand there a full minute before I picked it back up. I told myself to breathe, to not do the thing I always do, which is start solving the problem before I've even asked myself whether it's mine to solve in the first place. Because here's what that group chat conveniently left out. This was not the first time a photo had shown up in my family before a bill did. It wasn't the 5th time either. My mother doesn't send prices. She sends pictures, and she lets the pictures do the asking for her, because a picture of a happy boy standing on a dock is very hard to argue with, and by the time anyone actually says a dollar amount out loud, the deposit is already sitting on somebody's card. I picked the phone back up and read the number one more time. $7,200 for a high school graduation. And somewhere under my ribs, a decade of quiet arithmetic started adding itself up, whether I gave it permission or not. The way a claim file keeps building itself in the background, even when you've closed the tab and gone home for the night. You have to understand something about how a number like this gets built, because nobody hands you a bill for 10 years all at once. It arrives just this once at a time, dressed up so gently you barely notice it's a debt until it's grown teeth. My brother Kyle is 4 years younger than me, and he has always been the one my parents worry about, the one whose bad luck somehow requires better credit than his own. I am the one who has good credit. I am the one with the steady paycheck, and the calm voice, and the job where I'm paid to say no to people professionally, which apparently makes me the perfect person to say yes to my own family every single time. That voicemail my mother left 11 minutes after the text was the part I keep replaying, because it wasn't loud, and it wasn't cruel in any way a stranger would recognize. It was warm, almost soft, the exact tone she uses right before she asks me to give something up. Renee, honey, I know it's a lot, but you're the one who can make this happen for your nephew. You always have been. Family takes care of family. That's just what we do. And there it was, the whole religion of my childhood folded into 11 seconds of voicemail, delivered so gently it almost sounded like love, instead of what it actually was, which was an invoice with a bow on it. I stood in my kitchen that night, with the phone in one hand, and the folder I hadn't opened in years sitting on the shelf across the room, and I felt something shift that had nothing to do with $7,200 and everything to do with every single dollar that had come before it. Whatever happened next wasn't going to be about my nephew's graduation. It was going to be about the 10 years nobody in that chat had ever once bothered to add up, and the one call I was about to make sure they finally did. I want to explain what I actually do for a living, because it matters for everything that comes after. I work claims for a regional insurance company, which sounds boring until you understand what it actually trains into you. My whole job is looking at a story somebody tells me. A car accident, a flooded basement, a fire that started in a kitchen at 2 in the morning, and finding the seam where the story and the facts don't quite line up. People lie to insurance adjusters constantly, not always on purpose, but because grief and panic make people round numbers up or forget details that don't help their case. My job is to stay calm while everyone around me is panicking, ask the one boring question nobody wants to answer, and never approve a payout until the math actually holds. 12 years of that changes how your brain works. It changes how you read a text message from your own mother. So when that graduation message landed in the family chat, I did what I always do, which is separate the feeling from the figure. The feeling was, of course, I want to help Tyler celebrate. The figure was $7,200, due Monday, with zero explanation of who else was contributing, what the actual budget breakdown was, or why a high school graduation needed a rented lake house with a private dock at all. In my line of work, when somebody hands you a total with no itemization and a deadline attached, that's not generosity being requested. That's pressure being applied. I just hadn't ever let myself use that language about my own family before, because using it felt like an accusation I wasn't ready to make. Here's the thing about our family group chat that took me years to actually see clearly. Nobody in it ever sends a budget. They send photos, a rental listing with warm lighting, a boy standing at home plate in a New Jersey, a car with a bow taped to the hood in a stock image nobody bothered to remove. The photos do the emotional labor so the number never has to stand there naked and get questioned. And the responses always come fast, always warm, always from people who will not be opening their own wallets. My Aunt Rosalind, God love her, has never once in her life paid for anything in that chat, but she has sent more heart emojis than anyone alive. My father's thumbs up is his entire financial contribution to most family events, and everyone accepts that as normal, because his job in this family was never money. His job was mine. Nobody asked me if I could do this. That's the detail that sat with me longest that first night. Nobody said, "Renee, is this something you're able to take on right now?" They said it the way you'd announce a decision that had already been made somewhere else, in some other room, without you present, and then handed to you as a fact you were simply being informed of. Wire $7,200 by Monday. Not, could you consider contributing? Not, what do you think is fair? A command, phrased warmly enough that objecting to it would make me look like the difficult one, the cold one, the aunt who didn't care whether her own nephew had a nice send-off into adulthood. That's the part that took me the longest to name out loud, even to myself. In my family, there is a religion, and its central commandment is family, takes care of family. It sounds beautiful when you say it fast. It sounds like warmth, like loyalty, like the kind of household you'd want to grow up in. But I have come to understand, slowly and expensively, that in practice it never means all of us take care of all of us equally. It means the ones who can carry the ones who won't, indefinitely, without complaint, and everybody calls that arrangement love. so that nobody ever has to call it what it actually is, which is a system with exactly one working part. I thought about my mother's voicemail again that night. The softness of it, the way she said, "You're the one who can make this happen," like it was a compliment instead of an assignment. In my family, being called the strong one was never really praise. It was paperwork. It meant you had been quietly signed up for something without your consent, and the only proof of the signature was the fact that everyone else in the room already knew what you were going to do before you did it yourself. I had been the strong one since I was maybe 19 years old, since the summer Kyle's first car broke down, and I was the only one with a credit card that wasn't already maxed, and I paid the repair bill without blinking, because that's what a good sister does, and nobody in that kitchen ever once suggested I shouldn't have to. Sitting there that Thursday night with my coat still on, I realized something that made my stomach turn, in a way I wasn't ready for yet. I had spent over a decade being informed of decisions rather than being asked about them, and I had mistaken the frequency of being needed for the presence of being loved. Those are not the same thing, and no one in my family had ever once sat me down and explained the difference, because the whole arrangement depended on me never noticing there was one. You have to understand how a number like $7,200 doesn't actually start with a graduation party. It starts a decade earlier, small and forgettable, dressed up as a favor between two people who love each other, and it just keeps adding rooms onto itself, until one day you look up, and you're living inside a house you never agreed to build. The first one I can actually put a date to was the summer I was 23. Kyle's transmission gave out in a grocery store parking lot in July, and my mother called me at work, breathless, saying he needed $600 by that afternoon, or the shop wouldn't even look at the car. I paid it from my own account without a second thought, because $600 felt like nothing, felt like the kind of thing a good sister simply handles, and nobody in that family ever once thanked me in a way that suggested they understood what it had cost me to have that money sitting there in the first place. After that, it just kept coming, one just this once at a time, each one small enough on its own to feel almost embarrassing to refuse. There was the security deposit on Kyle's first apartment, because his credit wasn't strong enough yet, and mine was. There was Tyler's orthodontist bill the year he turned 11, because Kyle and his wife were between jobs, and I was the only one whose card wouldn't get declined at the register. There was a phone bill Kyle swore he'd pay back within 2 weeks that somehow never got mentioned again by either of us, as if silence on both ends made it disappear. Each one arrived wrapped in urgency, small enough to feel petty to refuse, and every single time it came with some version of the same sentence. "You're the only one I can ask, Renee." And I was. I always was. I moved the money before I ever let myself feel it leaving, because feeling it would have meant admitting there was a pattern, and admitting there was a pattern would have meant I actually had to do something about it. So I didn't count. That was my entire strategy, if you can even call it that. I kept every text, every Venmo confirmation, every bank transfer receipt in a folder I never once opened, the same way you keep a smoke detector in the hallway and just assume it's working because you haven't heard it go off. Somewhere in those years, I noticed I had started putting things in my own name too, not just paying for them but signing for them, holding them, becoming the account attached to whatever my family needed next. Just so you don't lose the reservation, Renee, just so the loan gets approved. You'll get it back. I never got it back, but I never asked for it back either, and that particular silence belonged entirely to me, not to them. I was the fixer, and being the fixer felt close enough to being loved that I stopped bothering to check whether there was actually a difference. I grew up the older daughter in a house where money was always tight, and affection was always loud, but somehow never quite landed anywhere useful, and somewhere along the way, I learned that the fastest route to being needed was to be endlessly, reliably useful. Kyle was the one people worried over. I was the one people counted on. Those two things sound similar if you say them quickly enough, but they are not the same thing at all, and the second one is a great deal lonelier than it looks from the outside. When you're the reliable one in a family, nobody actually checks on you. They only ever check whether you're available. So I made myself available, over and over, for 10 years, paying deposits and fronting holds and keeping that folder shut on the shelf, because as long as I was the one holding everything up, I never had to find out whether they would still want me around the day I finally put it down. That was the arrangement I had made with my own family, without ever once saying it out loud, and here is the sentence I would have carved into that folder if I'd ever had the nerve to open it sooner. Love that keeps a balance isn't love. But love that never checks the balance isn't safe either. I had spent a decade so afraid of the first half of that sentence that I never once let myself look at the second, telling myself that checking would be cold, that counting would be cruel, that real families simply don't audit each other. And a family that had spent 35 years training me to believe exactly that was now, without a hint of self-awareness, about to send me a bill for $7,200 and call it a graduation gift. What made this one different, what made it finally cut through the fog of 10 years of just this once, was timing nobody in that chat had any idea about. 3 weeks earlier, I had quietly started underwriting on my very first house, a small 2-bedroom on the edge of town, with a crooked porch step and a kitchen window that looked out onto an actual tree instead of a parking lot. And to me, it felt like the first thing in my entire adult life that was going to belong to nobody but me. My loan officer had been direct about it in a way I appreciated. Keep your reserves exactly where they are. Do not move large sums around before closing. Do not take on new financial obligations right now, even small ones. In other words, do not do the one thing my entire family had spent a decade training me to do the second anybody said the word emergency. My family had no idea any of this was happening, because in my family you don't get to be proud out loud unless the pride is about somebody else. I hadn't told them about the house yet, not because I was hiding it exactly, but because announcing it felt like bragging, and bragging had never once been safe territory for me to stand on. To them, I was still just Renee, the sister with the steady job, the one who was doing fine, always fine. Fine worn so long and so convincingly that they had genuinely started to believe it was simply my personality, rather than a costume I had learned to put on. They didn't know that $7,200 wasn't a favor I could quietly absorb this time. They didn't know it was the exact difference between closing on that house in 3 weeks and starting the entire search over from nothing. And that, more than the dollar amount itself, is the part that finally turned something loose in my chest. Not the cake, not the jerseys, not even the number. It was the realization that they were reaching, without even knowing it, for the one drawer in my whole life I had spent almost a decade learning to keep locked. Before I did anything drastic, I tried the reasonable thing first, because I need you to understand, I gave this family a door before I ever touched a lock. I called my mother the next morning, and I kept my voice deliberately easy because I've learned over 12 years of this job that the calmer you sound, the more room a person gives themselves to say the truth without realizing they've said it. I told her I loved Tyler, and I wanted his graduation to feel special, and then I asked her a simple, professional question, the kind of thing I'd ask any client whose numbers didn't add up cleanly. Just curious, I said, what's the actual breakdown here? What's the full budget? Itemized. I wasn't trying to start a fight, I just wanted to see the whole picture before anyone talked about who was paying for what. There was a pause on the line, the kind my mother does when she's deciding exactly how much of a thing to hand you, and how much to keep folded up out of sight. Why does it matter, Renee? She finally said. Family takes care of family. That's just what we do. And there it was again, delivered in that same warm, certain voice. The whole architecture of my childhood compressed into one sentence that was supposed to end the conversation before it had really begun. I asked again, softer this time, genuinely trying. How much is the lake house alone? What's already been put down as a deposit? My mother sighed like I was the one being difficult. You already handled the first part of it, remember? Back in the spring. So really, this isn't even that much more on top. I sat very still holding the phone, because I did remember. in the way you remember a dream you convinced yourself couldn't possibly have been real. Back in April, Kyle had called me in a rush, saying the lake house he wanted for graduation was about to get booked by another family, that the manager needed a card on file that day, or the whole thing would fall through. I'd read my own card number off the back of it, standing in a grocery store parking lot on my lunch break, because saying no in that moment would have made me the reason my nephew's graduation didn't happen, and I had never once in my life been willing to be that person. I hung up with my mother and pulled up my card statements right there at my kitchen table, scrolling back with the same cold, careful attention I give a suspicious claim file, and there it was. $1,400, charged to my card in my name, for a lake house I would never once set foot on the dock of. If a hold that size had slipped past me disguised as a favor, I had to ask myself what else had. How many other little strings were tied quietly to the bottom of my accounts while I kept my folder shut and my mouth shut and told myself that not looking was somehow the same thing as generosity? I didn't answer that question yet. I just closed the laptop and let it sit there on the counter, looking at me, for the first time in longer than I could remember. The part that actually broke something loose in me, though, wasn't the money at all. It was a conversation I had with Tyler 2 days later, when he showed up at my apartment unannounced, which he rarely does, and sat down at my kitchen table without quite meeting my eyes. Tyler is 18 now, tall and quiet in the way boys get right, before they figure out who they actually are, and he has always been sharper than anyone in my family gives him credit for. He picked at the edge of a napkin for a while before he finally said it. "You don't have to pay for all this, Aunt Renee. I heard Mom on the phone." I asked him what he meant, and he told me, in that flat, careful voice teenagers use when they've decided a thing is true and stopped being surprised by it, that he never actually wanted the lake house. He wanted a backyard cookout with the 6 or 7 kids he actually eats lunch with, not a guest list of 40 relatives and co-workers his father wanted to impress, most of whom Tyler had met maybe twice in his entire life. "It's not really for me," he said, and he said it flatly. The way you say something you've known for a while and have finally stopped hoping wasn't true. My nephew had figured out at 18 what it had taken me 35 years and a folder full of receipts to name out loud. This party was never really about his graduation. It was about my brother needing to prove to a family that measures love in square footage and dollar amounts that his son's send-off could match whatever imaginary bar everyone else had quietly set. And Tyler, sweet, watchful Tyler, was about to become the excuse for a bill he never once asked anyone to run up in his name. I sat with him at that table a long time, and something shifted in me that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with what I was actually protecting. I had driven into this thinking my job was to decide whether I could afford the party. Sitting there with my nephew picking at a napkin, I understood that wasn't the real question at all. The real question was who this party had actually been built for, and it clearly wasn't him. That night, once he'd gone home, I finally walked over to the shelf in my closet and took down the folder I had spent almost 10 years pretending I didn't need to open. I didn't open it yet. I just held it. The way you hold something heavy, right before you decide whether you're strong enough to carry it all the way to where it needs to go. If your phone only ever lights up when someone needs your card number, you already know exactly what this next part feels like. That particular dread of finally adding up a thing you've spent years making sure you never had to look at directly. Tell me in the comments if you've ever been the one who always pays, and then stay with me, because subscribing is how you'll find out what the total actually turned out to be. That night I couldn't sleep, so I did the thing I'd been avoiding for a decade. I sat down at my kitchen table at nearly midnight and finally opened the folder. It was thicker than I expected. Bank statements, screenshots of Venmo requests, a handful of handwritten notes from years back when Kyle still bothered to write me a promise on a sticky note before he stopped bothering to write anything at all. I made coffee I didn't need and opened a blank spreadsheet, because a folder is a feeling, but a spreadsheet is a fact, and I was finally done letting myself have feelings about this without also having numbers to match them. I built 4 columns: date, what it was for, the amount, and a 4th column labeled paid back, which I already suspected was going to sit almost empty. I started with the transmission, 12 years back, $600, and worked forward one line at a time, refusing to let myself round anything, refusing to soften a single figure the way I've trained myself never to soften a claim just because the story behind it is sad. The security deposit, the braces, the phone bill that quietly vanished from conversation on both ends, the lake house hold from April, $1,400, still sitting there in my own name. Line after line after line, each one small on its own, each one wrapped in the same urgent kindness, each one closing my folder a little tighter around my own ribs than the one before it. Somewhere close to 1 in the morning, I stopped typing and just stared at the running total in the corner of the screen, and for a long moment, I genuinely could not make myself scroll down far enough to see the rest of it. When I finally did, the number sitting there in cold blue font was $38,900. $38,900 over 12 years, and not one single entry in that 4th column. Not $1 of it had ever come back to me. I didn't cry, because crying is a feeling, and I had retired those for the night the moment I opened that spreadsheet. I just sat there and looked at the number the way you look at a diagnosis you already suspected, but were hoping the doctor would somehow talk you out of. $38,900 is most of a down payment. It's years of a kid's college tuition. It's a house I could have owned outright by now, instead of one I was still nervously underwriting. I had given my family a life I would never once get to live inside of. Just this once at a time. And I had done it so quietly for so long that they had genuinely come to believe the money simply appeared. The way rain appears. The way I always seemed to appear whenever the phone rang. And here is what that ledger taught me at 1 in the morning that no amount of feeling ever could have taught me on its own. I had not been helping my family. Helping has a natural end built into it. Helping makes someone stronger, and then quietly steps back to let them stand on their own. What I had actually been doing had no end built into it at all, because I had never once wanted it to end. After all, ending it would have meant finally finding out who I actually was to these people the moment I stopped paying. I had spent a decade funding a way of life for my brother and calling it love, and they had spent that same decade accepting it and calling it the same thing, and the word love had quietly covered for both of us the entire time. There was one more discovery sitting in that spreadsheet, and it was the piece that turned everything from grief into a plan. As I rebuilt the last few months line by line, I had to pull up the actual account confirmations to get the figures exactly right, and that's when I noticed something I had somehow never let myself see clearly before. The lake house deposit was on my card, under my name, with a confirmation number tied to my email address. The custom jerseys, ordered the week before, were on a payment plan I had authorized over the phone back in April, without ever once reading the fine print. Even the down payment toward Tyler's future car, the one with 3 heart emojis stacked on top of it in the family chat, had been set up as a hold against my own account, because Kyle's approval had come back too low, and mine, as always, had come back clean. I sat back in my chair and let that settle all the way through me. For 12 years, I had felt like nothing more than my family's wallet, a passive thing that money simply flowed out of whenever somebody needed it. Opened on demand, never once asked what it wanted for itself. But a wallet has no power of its own. A signatory does, and somewhere in the fog of 10 years of small, urgent favors, I had quietly become the one legally attached to the very party I was now being ordered to pay for in full. Every hold in that room had my name on it, which meant, I understood slowly, with the cold, clean feeling of a column finally balancing after years of refusing to close, that everything I had the power to place, I also had the power to release. Before I did anything with what I now knew, I gave them one more chance, because I needed you to understand I never wanted this to end in a war. The next afternoon, I sent Kyle a calm, careful message, The kind I would send a client whose numbers didn't quite add up, but who I still hoped could be reasoned with. I told him I loved him and I loved Tyler, and I wanted this graduation to feel like something real. Then I offered what I genuinely believed was fair. Let's sit down together, I wrote, just the two of us, and build an actual budget, something Tyler would love that we could both honestly afford. I'll put in a set amount, a real number, out in the open where we can both see it. No more surprise holds. No more finding out later what my name is attached to. Just two people who love this kid, deciding together. I read it over twice before I hit send, and for one small hopeful moment I actually believed we might land somewhere better than where we'd started. Kyle called me instead of texting back, which I should have known meant something, because he only ever calls when he wants me to hear the exact shape of his voice breaking. Wow, he said. So I'm applying for a budget review now with my own sister. That's what this is. I told him that wasn't what I'd meant at all, that I'd said the opposite, that I'd said let's plan it together. Together, he repeated, like the word tasted wrong in his mouth. You want a meeting. You want me to justify my son's graduation to you, like I'm filling out a loan application. And there it was, laid out plainly on the phone line, the entire difference between how the two of us had been raised to understand the same childhood. To me, a budget was respect. It meant I took him and Tyler seriously enough to plan with them honestly. To Kyle, a budget was an accusation, proof that I finally saw the family the way I saw a claims file, numbers to be verified instead of people simply to be trusted and given to. Real families don't do this, Renee, he said, and his voice actually cracked on the word families. Real tears this time, not the performed kind he sometimes reaches for. Real families don't count. I didn't argue with him, because there wasn't anything left to argue. He meant it completely, all the way down, because he had been raised in the same house I had, where counting anything out loud was treated as the coldest act a person could commit, and where the highest form of love was simply to give until it hurt, and never once glance at what it had cost you. I had spent 12 years being the exception that made his rule possible, the one who gave endlessly and never once counted where it went, and now that I'd finally picked up a pencil, to him that pencil looked exactly like a betrayal, worse somehow than the actual dollar amount ever could have been. He hung up before I could say anything else, and I sat there understanding that the reasonable door I had opened for him had just been closed firmly from his side. Then the vendors started calling, and that's when I understood the fog had a deadline built right into it. The Lake House Company emailed first, a polite professional note reminding Ms. Ashford that the remaining balance was due in full, within 72 hours to hold the reservation, and that the card on file would be automatically charged the moment that window closed. The card on file was mine. The Jersey company sent a text about the second half of their payment plan. The dealership's finance office called about finalizing the down payment transfer before the weekend. Every single one of these messages was addressed to me, because every single hold belonged to my name, and none of them had any idea or any reason to care that the party they were billing me for had become a fight I was actively losing with my own family. I know some of you watching this are already yelling at the screen, hang up, block them all, don't pay a cent. Stay with me, because it wasn't that simple yet. And what my mother said next is the whole reason I finally stopped trying to be reasonable about any of it. If I did nothing at all, the full amount would hit my card automatically within 3 days, drawing straight from the exact reserves my loan officer had specifically told me not to touch, and a party I had never actually agreed to fund would become real on my dime whether I wanted it to or not. That is the quiet genius of how situations like this get built, even though nobody sits down and designs them on purpose. By the time I understood the full shape of the trap, I was already standing inside it, holding the only key that could open the door back out. My phone rang while I was still staring at the Lake House email, and the screen said Mom, and I knew before I even answered that she was calling to close the exact door I had just found. My mother does not raise her voice, and that has always been what makes her so effective, because a woman who never once yells makes you feel like the unreasonable one simply for having needs of your own. Renee, she said. warm and tired, using the voice she reserves for ending conversations. This has gone far enough. She didn't ask my side of anything. She didn't mention the budget I'd offered Kyle, which told me everything about whose version of the story she'd already accepted as fact. Your father and I have talked about this, she went on, and we think it's time you understood something. You've always been the strong one, Renee. That's not a punishment. That's just what being family means sometimes. I stayed quiet because I have learned that silence makes people say the truest version of whatever they actually came to say. And into that silence, gently, almost lovingly, my mother finished the thought. Pay the balance, honey. Finish what you started with that lake house deposit back in the spring, because if you don't, if you let your nephew's graduation fall apart over money, I don't know how the rest of this family looks at you afterwards. There it was, finally spoken out loud after 35 years of only ever being implied. Not a threat exactly, not in the words themselves, but unmistakable underneath them. Pay up, or find out exactly how conditional your place at this table has always actually been. After a sentence like that, most people fall apart, and I want to tell you I did, because it would probably make me easier to root for. But I didn't. I did the thing I do at work, when a claim comes in that changes the shape of the entire investigation. I got very, very calm. It's a strange gift, that particular kind of quiet, the one where everyone around you is loud, and you go still, separate the feeling from the figure, and look at what's actually true underneath all the noise. So I sat at my kitchen table with the phone still warm in my hand, and I let the feeling take one chair. My mother just told me my place in this family has a price tag on it. Then I pulled the figure into the chair across from it. I had a decision to make within 72 hours, and I was the only person alive who could make it. I looked at both of them sitting there in front of me, and I finally let myself finish the thought my mother had started for me without meaning to. If I paid the 7 Tyler a graduation, I would not be buying Tyler a graduation. Tyler had already told me, sitting at this very table 2 days earlier, that he didn't want any of it. What I would actually be buying was another decade of exactly this, another 10 years of favors that never once made it into a paid-back column, another folder I'd never let myself open again, another one in the morning somewhere down the road, with a number even larger and lonelier than $38,900. My mother hadn't threatened me at all. Not really. She had made me an offer, and she had made the terms unusually clear for a woman who had spent her whole life speaking almost entirely in implication. Keep paying. Stay family. And for the first time in 35 years, I let myself ask the question underneath that offer, instead of flinching away from it. What kind of family charges admission? What kind of membership can only ever be renewed in cash? I want to be honest about the harder part, because it's the real one, the one underneath all the money entirely. Once I let myself actually imagine stopping, not paying, not smoothing things over, not fixing it the way I always fixed it, a much older and much quieter question rose from somewhere I'd never let myself look before. If I stop paying, who am I to them at all? For 12 years, being the one who covered things had been my entire location inside that family. It was how I knew where I stood at every holiday, why I got handed the good chair at Thanksgiving, why my mother called me the strong one, and my father let me know things he never told anyone else. Take away the paying, and I genuinely did not know what was left standing underneath it. I sat with that fear a long time, because it deserved to be sat with, and then I picked up the phone, and I did what I had spent an entire folder learning how to do properly. I read every contract line by line, the way I should have read them the very first day I signed anything at all. The lake house agreement was clear once I actually looked at it instead of just skimming past the parts that scared me. The deposit had secured the reservation, and the remaining balance was due within a set window before the event, and if that balance wasn't paid, the venue could simply release the date back onto the open calendar. In plain language, I could still cancel. It was my card holding the reservation, which meant the whole thing lived or died on my authorization, and nobody else's. If I called before that automatic charge posted, I could release the hold entirely and lose only the original deposit, money that was already gone regardless of what I decided to do next. The Jersey company worked the same way. Deposit forfeited, remaining balance simply canceled. The dealership down payment was still sitting in a holding account that hadn't transferred yet, which meant I could stop that too with a single phone call. There was one catch, and it's the reason I couldn't sit on this decision and sleep on it like a sensible, patient person. The lake house's 72-hour window was already counting down, and their email had said plainly that the balance would auto-charge the card on file the moment that window closed. If I waited even one more day hoping for one more conversation, one more chance to be understood, the decision would get made for me by a billing system that had absolutely no interest in my family or my feelings about any of it. I could stop this, but only that night. Not tomorrow, not after Kyle called back softer. Tonight or the party became mine forever, paid for by a woman it was never actually meant to include. I sat with the real cost of it for a long moment before I picked up the phone, because I'm not a reckless person, and this was going to cost me something no spreadsheet could ever properly show. It wasn't the deposit money. I had already made my peace with losing that. It was this. The moment I canceled these holds, the secret would be over completely. My whole family would learn all at once that the lake house, the jerseys, the car, all of it had quietly been sitting on my card the entire time, and that the invisible, generous aunt everyone assumed simply appeared with money had actually been bankrolling their lives from behind a curtain for over a decade. The mask was about to come off. Not the mask of a villain, the mask of a saint, and honestly the second one is a great deal harder to set down. At 11 that night, I called the lake house's after-hours line, and a tired young man answered on the third ring, sounding like he'd rather be anywhere else. I gave him the confirmation number, my name, the card on file, and then I said the sentence I had been walking toward for 12 years and $38,900. I need to cancel the reservation completely. He asked if I was certain. I told him I was. He explained the deposit was non-refundable, but the balance would simply be released, and the date would go back onto their open calendar for anyone else to book. I told him I understood, and I authorized it. Then I called the Jersey company and stopped that payment plan. Then I logged into the dealership's finance portal and withdrew the down payment hold before it could ever transfer. 3 phone calls, maybe 14 minutes total, and a decade of one particular version of me, quietly, permanently ended, in less time than it takes to reheat a plate of leftovers. I set the phone down on the table and noticed my hands were shaking, which surprised me, because underneath the shaking I felt strangely, enormously still, the stillness of something that has finally stopped being carried uphill. I had lit a fire I couldn't put back out, in a family that was going to call it arson the moment they woke up to find it. By morning, they would all know there was no more smoothing this over, no more quiet fixing, no more folder staying shut on a shelf. I typed one final message into the family group chat before I let myself sleep, calm and level, telling them the holds I had placed were now canceled because they had been in my name the entire time, and I could not keep carrying them any longer, and that I would be at my parents' house at 7 the next morning if anyone wanted to actually talk about it. Then I printed the spreadsheet, every single line of it, and slid the pages into that same folder I had finally emptied, and set it by my keys so I wouldn't forget it, though there was no version of that morning where I was ever going to forget it. I got to my parents' house at 6:50 the next morning, because I have never once been late to anything in my life, and I sat in the driveway drinking gas station coffee, watching the kitchen light flick on inside. Kyle's truck was already parked at the curb, which told me everything. He'd driven over the moment he saw my message, to strategize with our parents before I could even walk through the door, the same way he always tried to get ahead of me. I gave myself one more minute in the car, and then I picked up the folder, and I walked in, and I had barely gotten the door shut behind me when Kyle's phone lit up on the kitchen table, screen facing up, and all 3 of us read it at the same moment. An email. Subject line: Your reservation has been released. Timestamp: 7:28. Kyle grabbed the phone, and his whole face did something I had genuinely never once seen it do before. A full weather system of confusion, sliding into dawning horror in the space of about 2 seconds. "What is this?" he said. Not really a question at all. "It says the reservation's been released." He looked up at me, and my father looked up from his coffee, and my mother froze at the counter with a dish towel still in her hands, and for one long suspended moment, the whole kitchen simply held still, while the truth arrived on a 7:28 timestamp exactly the way I already knew it would. "Renee," my father said slowly, "what did you do?" I set my keys down. I set the folder on the table, unopened, squared perfectly to the edge the way I square everything I've ever touched at work. "I canceled the holds that were in my name," I said, in the calmest voice I own. "All of them, last night." The kitchen erupted almost instantly, but I want you to notice what I noticed even as it was happening. I was the only person standing in that room who wasn't afraid, because for the first time in my entire life inside that house, I already knew every single number on the table, and they were only just now finding out there had ever been a table at all. Kyle came at me first, loud and wet and certain, and I let him. "You waited until the last second," he shouted. "You ruined this on purpose to make some kind of point. Because you're bitter. Because you're alone. Because you can't stand watching anybody else be happy for once." My father stood up. "That's enough. Both of you," he said. But he was looking directly at me when he said it, not at Kyle, and I understood in that instant that both of you had only ever meant me in this house. My mother was already crying, saying my name like a plea. "Renee, honey, we can still fix this. We can still make some calls." And that word, fix, in my mother's mouth, was the last small push I needed, because I knew exactly who "we can fix this" had always secretly meant. It meant me. It had always meant me. I did not raise my voice. I have never once raised my voice in that kitchen, and I wasn't going to start on the morning I finally stopped being afraid of what happened if I stayed quiet forever. I waited until the noise ran itself out of gas, until Kyle was breathing hard, and my father was red-faced, and my mother had both hands pressed over her mouth, and then I slid the folder to the center of the table and opened it myself. "Before anyone else says another word about fixing anything," I said, "I want everyone in this kitchen to see what we've actually been fixing for 12 years. $38,900, laid out line by line, one empty column, and 4 faces going pale in a kitchen that had spent an entire lifetime insisting we were the kind of family that never keeps score." I could have closed that folder right then. I want you to know, I felt both roads open in front of me at the same time. I could have said I overreacted, offered to cover the balance one last time, and watched the relief flood back into that room instantly, and I would have gotten to keep my chair, my father's approval, my old comfortable title as the strong one. That road was right there, and it would have cost me everything real in exchange for everything familiar. I didn't take it. "I'm not paying because I stopped loving Tyler," I told them, my voice steady the whole way through. "I'm canceling because I finally started loving myself enough to stop." The weeks after were quieter than I expected, and lonelier than I want to pretend they weren't. My father didn't call for almost a month, and when he finally did, we talked about the weather, and neither of us mentioned that kitchen, which is about the closest thing to an apology a man like him has ever known how to offer. 2 of my aunts stopped speaking to me entirely, having decided somewhere along the family telegraph that I was the daughter who abandoned her own nephew over money, and I let them believe it, because you cannot correct a story in a house that badly needs you to be its villain. But my reserves stayed exactly where my loan officer told me to keep them, and I closed on my little house with the crooked porch step 3 weeks later, standing alone in that empty living room, and finally letting myself cry, not from grief this time, but from the strange vertigo of holding a future that actually belonged to me. Kyle scaled the graduation down to a backyard cookout with 7 of Tyler's actual friends, string lights borrowed from a neighbor, burgers on a grill instead of custom jerseys, and from everything I heard, it was the best night of that kid's entire year. I wasn't invited, and that's a wound I'm still letting heal on its own schedule. But Tyler texted me a photo from it anyway, just him and his friends laughing under those borrowed lights, with a caption that said, "Wish you were here," and I hadn't paid one single dollar toward any of it. It was, without question, the most love that family had ever managed to build out of the least amount of money, which is the exact lesson $38,900 had never once managed to teach any of us. 4 months later, Tyler texted me again, this time asking if I could show him how to build one of my spreadsheets, because he'd gotten a part-time job and opened his very first savings account and wanted to figure out the real number on a trip he was planning before he ever asked his father for a dime. I read that message standing in my own kitchen, in my own house, and I had to sit down right there on the floor, because that was the whole thing. That was the chain finally breaking one link earlier than it ever had before. If you have ever been the family ATM, the one they only remember when the card gets declined, you already know the truth. It took me 12 years and $38,900 to finally learn. Sometimes the most loving word in the entire language is simply no. If this story reached something in you, share it with the person who needs to hear it tonight. Tell me in the comments about the last time you finally said no to someone you loved, and subscribe to The Dramatic Story so you never miss what happens next.